Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's IDN webinar for Quinnipiac University. We are really excited to have Adam Nemeroff and Francis Rowe from the Learning, Design, and Technology Department at Quinnipiac to talk a bit about the hiring process for instructional designers and provide some tips for how you can position yourself in the marketplace to land instructional design positions. So I will turn things over to Adam.
Thank you, Kristen. Yeah, so this started, Francis, Jean, and I were in the process of searching for a designer a few months back now. I'm trying to think when Alex's search was. Must have been like mid to late fall. We were wrapping that up, and when we were talking about it, we were like, wouldn't it be great to be able to like share with others what does this process look like? Because as I'm sure many of you have experienced, it's kind of opaque. You're like, how do I share things? How do I speak about myself? How do I connect with the team? What's happening at all these points in the process where like I don't know what's going on? And like, what are the best ways to help to reach out for people to be best positioned to be in that search process? So at the time, Jean, Francis, and I were kind of talking through it, and we were like, oh, let's pitch this idea to Kristen. So thank you, Kristen, for taking us up on it. And I'm really curious to hear from all of you about your experiences and interest with this, and some of that. And then this past semester, I taught the capstone course. And with several of the students, I kind of did a version of this in one-on-ones on Zoom and just kind of talking about the process and helping them to refine their materials. And a good deal of that course at the end of it is about kind of telling your ID story and how do you frame yourself professionally as a designer. So that's where that piece kind of comes in. My thinking, so I'm Adam Nemeroff. I direct the instructional design group. Francis, did you want to briefly introduce yourself? You have the best background ever. Look at this. Cape Ann is gorgeous.
Yeah, so I'm balancing my laptop right now in the chair. I've been an instructional designer for over 20 years this summer. Yeah, I'm going to be teaching the interactive development course where students, it's personalized. It's the first time, they're going to have a choice of the authoring platform. Yeah, I'm sorry if you're hearing the waves in the background. But yeah, if I can be of any help in this session, I had an opportunity to look at a lot of resumes recently of students. So thank you. Yeah.
And also Zoom is totally, in this case, canceling the ambiance. So kind of bummed I'm not getting the ocean waves there, Francis. I could use a little bit of that. Okay, so I'm going to start with just kind of framing some observations and some things that we talked about as a starting point for us. So we're going to talk a little bit about like why the application materials matter, how to kind of frame your story, what does that look like overall. We're going to talk a bit about some of the common issues. I think one of the biggest issues we've observed is when people don't, especially when you're applying for a lot of positions at once, like where you don't customize your story specific to what that organization's looking for. And I know it's a lot of work. I have some ideas about how to make it less work, but it's a huge part of landing and kind of getting into that practice. And we really want to help to kind of provide some practical tips. I'm curious to hear from all of you about this. I've also been thinking about this a lot with technology now for better, in good ways and bad ways, in kind of interacting with this process. The first thing that we talked a lot about when we were in our own search committee recently was like, it's really important to tailor those materials. So there are a couple different ways to do that. So I would say it's really important to actually cater those materials specific to the job description. So if you have your resume, I used to joke around that I had like a stump resume, kind of like a stump speech for a politician. That thing kind of gave my story, but then I would speak to a specific audience. And I would cater and kind of strategize about like what I wanted to include with that. And I think when I've seen that come through as a hiring manager now, I see where those are really the people who jump off the page. With the degree program experience, I've seen a lot of instructional design program grads. It's part about talking about the fact that you have the degree, but I think also contextualizing what experiences, what skills, what things are coming out of that. And there might be some creative ways to do that. I've often been thinking about like it's almost like adding another work experience section for the program. Like how can you really speak to your interests and what you're up to and how that comes in that way. I think another piece of it, especially for people making the career jump, or just kind of switching gears from one thing to another, thinking about framing your relevant experience via that new roles frame. So I had a student who did early childhood development work in the capstone this past spring. And one of the things she and I were talking about was like, it might be important to kind of frame your role as a trainer or a peer mentor to your other teachers. You can kind of think about those things specific to the job role, but that's a really key aspect to that. Another piece is really highlighting your work. So and we've talked a lot in committees about, the best candidates are often, they're showing and telling their story. They're showing that story instead of just telling the story. And so when you're looking at materials and somebody then links to an example of where they have experience with backwards design, or they have experience with accessibility and a project that really highlights that, I think that in addition to being specific, also just it becomes more resonant. And that's another thing that I really want to highlight in this. It helps the committee to have a visual in mind. One of the designers I hired at Dartmouth, I can still imagine she had this Blackboard example site that was just so incredibly well thought out. I could still see the image of it in my head. By having a portfolio and including, either screenshots of your work and kind of the explainer of it, can really, really help with that. And where possible, with a lot of these platforms, even with something like a PDF and a resume, you can use links and hyperlinks really strategically. So think about including descriptive links at certain points, and kind of consider that where it helps that way. So I started mentioning a little bit about this before, aligning with the job description and really kind of using that as the closest you'll get before the process starts. To understand where that committee is starting, can really help you to understand what that role is, how you align to it, and what you need to tell about your story within it. I know one of the things I didn't really value until I was in the role of a hiring manager is we put a lot of thought into the job descriptions. I'm not sure I think that's true everywhere, but we really thought through like, how do we capture what we think a great designer is in what we're trying to bring across. And that's really important because everything else is really aligned from that. And as more companies are embracing inclusive hiring practices, it's even more a part of like, how can you use that to objectively review applicants? How can you help the committee to really organize and form around those key areas? To really help to understand where people are coming in. I think the tailored resume is a huge piece of that. You'll want to definitely think about almost like a one-for-one alignment, where if there's like accountability, skills, and experiences listed here, you're like, okay, I'm hitting on that in each of my specific areas and bringing those in. And I think the cover letter also becomes a really key way for you to connect that story together. And it also helps, it creates a space for you to bring more narrative and story into it in a way that helps the committee to connect with you. One of the things I think a lot about, and this is part from inclusive hiring practices, just to reiterate this, whenever you see experiences and key accountabilities listed out, that always ends up being customized to that individual. So if you don't check every box, there are no unicorns out there. I've often like said that to my committees and colleagues. If you have a unicorn position description, you're setting yourself up for failure, because you ultimately want that to be shaped by the values and communicating that to the prospective employees. But you also want to bring that person in and have them bring what makes them into the process as well. And that's a huge piece of that. So I will say, like, when we're doing the hiring process and kind of scoring materials, we'll often, people with more of the criteria will rise further up in the stack, which is another reason for you to really think about how to align those things as much as possible. I don't know that every committee will do that, but that's something we've been really intentional about. I don't know if you want to add anything with that, Francis. I kind of got on a roll there.
Yeah, yeah, all great points. And the skills, that's obviously what we look for first, but then it's it's the soft skills, those socio-emotional intelligence aspects that they can come across in the resume and the portfolio, but they often, they come across in the interview process. And I would say, don't be afraid to be yourself, right? Shine in that interview, because we all, at the end of the day, we all have to spend time with each other in Zoom or in the office. So those social skills are, I think, just as important as what's on your resume. Thank you.
I'm glad you pulled out the skills piece too with that, Francis. I think with the skills specifically, I would think really carefully about what you list as your skills in your resume, both based on like what is included in the job description, what are kind of technical or specific skills that you have coming out of the program. Like one of the first things we try and do in a lot of searches is like if we mention a learning management system experience being beneficial and that we're looking for a preferred learning management system. Is that you, Francis, maybe? Do you mind muting, Francis?
Yeah,
Sorry.
it's not
all good.
going
It's all
good.
good.
I'm gonna have to log out. Sorry. Bye.
No, you're good. I think it was just the feedback. Okay, so one of the things that we'll look for is like if we're saying like desirable LMS experience, like specific to Blackboard or specific to Canvas, make sure you include keywords like that in your resume, and highlight the things that you might have gotten out of like the online teaching course and some of those other really specific experiences in the program. When we look for that, I think it's a key part of helping to flesh out that kind of picture overall, of you and how you can contribute to the team. One of the things I've talked a lot to people about more recently is it's imperative to optimize your materials for machines being in the process too. And now this is flipped back to you as well, because now with ChatGPT and other like generative tools, you can also use that in your part of the process too. One of the things I'm often amazed about is how many resumes come off as aesthetic, but not necessarily readable. And this brings in accessible document creation processes and things like that. It could also be a really key way for you to show to a committee that is looking for accessible web accessibility practices and things like that too, that you're thinking and cognizant of that. But realistically, you want to make sure that your resume could be read in a linear way. And that if a machine's doing that, it's not losing something in that. Because I can't tell you how many, I mean, our talent platforms at Quinnipiac don't have these capabilities, but I know of numerous ones elsewhere that do, especially in larger organizations. We have like Workday or one of these other tools, and it just kind of looks and helps surface keywords. And so every word, kind of like search engine optimization, like matters on that page. I think there's an added piece of this where if your resume doesn't look presentable in the ways that professionally you would want it to be, I think that could also be a pause point for a committee. And you hear this sometimes with people talking about, the way that you present yourself. Francis was talking about soft skills, your ability to write in clear and effective ways is one way that a committee is getting to know your attention to detail, your communication skills, your style of communication. The resume is another piece of that. So you want to make sure that that is reflecting that piece as well. And I have like two more of these, I think. The cover letter, so I talked a little bit about this before. This is really that space for personal narratives. It's also a great way for you to kind of demonstrate where you've done the homework about the organization. And that's both to demonstrate that to the hiring committee. But I think in my experiences, when I've written the best cover letters, and I'm thinking about my experience even most recently when I joined QU in August, I look at that as a research process. It's your opportunity to look at what can you find out about this institution? How can you associate with the various initiatives they have going on? How can you demonstrate that you're interested in this opportunity in ways that are really compelling and resonant with the committee? It's a huge piece of that. And I would say the last piece that I've been most fascinated with most recently with that is where people will reach out with another narrative piece of that in, say, LinkedIn. So if you know you really want to work in a specific environment and you can start reaching out and connecting with people before you even hire for the job, apply for the job. That's just one way to keep your name recognition there, to show that you care about what they do. I find I really have to like reply to those. Like I find, and so then you have like that name recognition piece again, but it can also be a great opportunity for you to even get an informational piece with that. That's just one thing I've noticed is like a personal touch. I guess it's kind of similar to people used to say, you know, like cold call people, pick up the phone, like just has like this personal touch that I think is really key when done well. So how can you take control of this? I think there are several ways that you could use technology really meaningfully at this point, and I can talk a little bit about how I've used it as a hiring manager in the process. I don't use it at all with applicant materials, so that's the first thing from like a privacy, data security, confidentiality standpoint. But where I have used a lot of more recent technology tools is I often co-write my job descriptions to ChatGPT now. And I've developed this process of like checking, you know, my organization is looking for like these 10 things. Are there other gaps or feedback you might have for me? So it's one way for me to check to make sure that I'm emphasizing and prioritizing the right things as a hiring manager to communicate to my audience. I think another piece of it too is I've often taken that same step and said, okay, what might be a couple of levels of interview questions for a Zoom interview or an in-person? What activities might I do to help to gauge that person's skills and experiences? There's some really powerful ways where large language models and generative AI can be a start with that. I always have it as a human in the loop. It's always something I'm co-writing, I'm checking with it. It's often when I've been like, I don't know how I want to start with these questions. And then I kind of go and play with AI. But those same features can help you to feed that job description into the generative AI as well and say, hey, I had one student last spring who's prepping for this past spring. Well, it feels like a year ago now. It was so fast. I had one student in the capstone this spring who used it to prep for the mock interview. So they took a job description, pasted it into ChatGPT and said, hey, ChatGPT, I want you to pretend to be an interview coach with me. Here's this job description I just came across. How should I approach, what should I expect for questions? How might I approach the answers? And it gave like a really tailored set of strategies for that process. And there might be other ways you could do that too, of like getting additional tips or strategies with the communication pieces. Just something to highlight that way. Are there questions about that piece? Like maybe we could pause there and then we could talk a little bit more about like what happens then in the hiring process as a result of that. But I wanna kind of create some space here for others to ask questions and yeah.
I did have a question, Adam.
Yeah.
Um, when you were talking about optimizing the resume with AI and machine reading, how do you necessarily do it the way you just described? After I've drafted my resume, uh, work experience, whatever, I feed it to GPT or something and have it give me feedback on where my holes are or something.
Yeah, so I have this, I'm prepping for a workshop next week with faculty on prompt engineering, but one of my favorite like 4 questions prompts, I'll paste it in the chat. Oh man, my Windows, sorry. One of my favorite ones is this. Oh wait, sorry, I'm having issues with my clipboard here. So these are like 4 things you could think about and think of as like little prompts for you. But what I tend to do with in the best kind of structured prompting is tell ChatGPT who I want it to be. Say like, hey, ChatGPT, I want you to be, you know, a hiring manager for an instructional design firm, or even in like corporate higher ed. Like you can kind of really tune that in. I play around with that in the context. You know, I'm person interviewing for this process. I have my draft resume. I want you to be my editor in this moment, as if I can bounce ideas. Here's the task. I want you to give me feedback or mark up my existing resume. There are different things that you could play with that way. I've done that both ways, like put in brackets what you would change as edits, and it'll just kind of keep your existing text and edit it. And then for the format, I often use either format or exemplar there. So like you can just paste in your resume. You can even paste in a job description and say, I've done that too, like comparing the two back and forth. Sometimes you have to, depending on the large language model, I think they're all pretty suited to that kind of a use case, but you might have to play around with, using the context window, like are there character limits on the free version versus the paid version. So if you're interested in chatting about that more, but that tends to be how I've approached it. Thank you for that. That's a great question, Angela.
Pretty good stuff. Can I just make a comment?
Yeah.
I've been with the Postal Service for 27 years. Before I came onto the Postal Service, back in the 90s, I think it was, maybe it was the 90s, we were using WordPerfect. I came to the Postal Service carrying mail, and I had an interview for an office job, and they were using Windows. I had no idea what that was. So I feel like when I complete my program, well, I'm hoping while I'm in the program, I'm going to learn a lot of the newer technologies that I'm going to need to be successful in my next career. So I'm gleaning all I can from you. And this has been very good so far. Power pack.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, yeah. And I would say like you're in a good place for that. Like I think just even thinking about my students from the spring, people come in at such different technological levels in a program like this with different backgrounds. And I think setting clear goals with it. And I think that's something that Kristen could probably help do some kind of coaching and advice giving on that. I'm more than happy to as well. I mean, I think the Office suite is a really good example of one that a lot of people put that, but if you could show that, like that's where some of these elements with skills and combining it together can be quite powerful.
I know Julianne has a question as well, Adam.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Julian.
Hi there. Yeah, so related to using ChatGTP to do cover letter drafting and maybe resume refurbs, how do you navigate merging your voice with the ChatGPT voice? Because I don't want to end up in a scenario where, like, I do freelance writing, so I definitely take a lot of pride in like my writer's voice, but I could see how that would be an asset because it could restructure things and call attention to things that maybe you're overlooking. But how do I find a way to merge that technical voice, the ChatGTP voice, with my voice so that when or if it moves to a one-to-one interview, I present as authentic from what I had in the application materials?
Oh, Julianne, I love this question. Like it's all my geeking things right now that I love talking to people about. So I think you're pointing out a really key limitation that we're seeing in the tools now. What I would say, two things I would say. One, I just finished Ethan Mollick's book with which Kristen, we have to connect about that at some point. I don't know if other people have come across it yet, but is it Co-Intelligence? Is that the name of it by Ethan Mollick? Fantastic book if you want a primer on like generative AI and thinking about some of these things. Could not recommend it more. And one of the rules that he has in the middle of the book is he has these like 4 rules for like interacting with generative AI, and humans in the loop is one of them. But my other favorite one that he talks about is we should all use generative AI right now, like knowing what it can do, but also being able to understand that this is the worst version of AI that we'll use. The version that we're using right now in 2024, and even just seeing what's happened over the last 2 years since when it came out in late 2022, you're already seeing this shift. So what you're describing right now, Julianne, is a real problem with this, right? Like so much of this ends up producing text that doesn't reflect voice, that doesn't have that like rhetorical awareness. Like it just kind of is lacking in those different ways. So there's a couple things that I do with it. One is I use it in very targeted ways for like, I want to help me to outline. So maybe it's like, help me to outline and structure a cover letter. I don't want you to write the cover letter, and help me to understand what I might want to include. Then I write it, and then I might even throw that back in and say, now edit this, and it will use the tokens of what I put together and how they're related to then figure out how to help me to make it better. So that's one way to give it like that exemplar piece that I was mentioned before. That can really help. I also will often use tools that are more geared towards like a writing toolkit. I'm a big fan of Grammarly Pro. We use that a lot in my team, and that's taken on an interesting role in our team now that there's more than just kind of spelling and grammar checks in there. There are ways that it can help you to structure phrases better. It can help you to improve the way that it's resonating with certain goals in mind, helps you to make it more persuasive or personalized. So we kind of use different tools at different points in the process based on that. But I think I would guess that within the less than a year, we're going to see more of like, I want to train this on my own writing and I want it to sound like me. I still don't know if I like that because I feel like it's not going to be good enough. And it's not going to be ethically what I want it to be, but kind of using it with these other creative tasks is huge.
Thanks for that. I like what you said. I could definitely see myself copy pasting text that I have, potentially copy pasting the job description and saying, hey, what am I missing? You know, what can you call out? Like asking it to sort of co-create with you instead of just be the sole creator.
I had this really funny, Chris, and I think you were at this meeting. I report to the provost at QU, and we were in this meeting with a group of faculty and other people in the AI steering committee. And in that moment, both my boss and I admitted to using AI in the process of generating the job description for my role. I admitted to using it in the cover letter. And then I had this like aha moment. I was like, I now can associate certain artifacts in that job description with like AI weirdnesses, like, and then I'm like, I wonder if they, and I used it in a different way. And like, I've talked lots to people here about like best ways of using AI, but it really got me thinking about like, where does that come into the process? The framing piece, I think is huge. It really can be quite helpful for you, like hitting the right notes with like, what should be outlined? What do I want to hit on? Did I actually hit on those things once I have a draft?
Yeah, the brainstorming piece makes sense.
Yeah,
Thank
Angela. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, I'll ask. Conversely, if I had if I were hiring and I've got 50 applicants, would I use AI to help me sift through those resumes?
This is where like
Or
the ethics come in, right? Like I think it's a really interesting moment. I had right before I came to QU, I was wrapping up a search for two designers at my last institution. I previously to QU worked at Dartmouth, and we had two fully remote positions posted, and we had 250 applicants, and we had to like close it down at that point because it checked a lot of boxes for people. It was remote, like it had that flexibility piece, and I think a lot of we saw people all over the country kind of applying for it. And I stared at this and I was like, I don't know what to do with 250. And I sat down with our HR person there. Um, and he was really helpful for like kind of, I was like, I feel like we could use AI to at least do like keyword searching or something like that. But nothing was really built out to the point we wanted it. So what we ended up doing was kind of this multi-screening process. So hopefully in certain environments you can pre-screen, kind of make sure that people meet the minimum requirements, and then kind of go from there and have maybe a committee big enough to divide that up. That's usually been what I've tried to do with like a multiple rater kind of system, and then people get together, short lists, and then we all read through the materials for those. So there are different ways you could do it that way, but I definitely don't feel confident recommending AI that way in the process right now.
thank you.
Yeah. Other questions, thoughts? So let's take a couple moments. I want to talk a little bit about like what happens once the process is unfolding and like what does it look like for the hiring process. I hit on some of this as we were talking overall, but I want to kind of put a couple of kind of emphasis points around this. So in most environments that I've come across, you almost always have a hiring committee and some sort of evaluation process as a part of that. That committee could be very tied to like the job function itself. It could be, other learning designers that you'd be working with. It could be a hiring manager. It could be somebody in a related team that you might be a key collaborator with. I've had the experience in past jobs where you actually build out the hiring committee part as a way to teach somebody about what your team does and how to approach that. So that's been something that I've seen even written in at certain points. You also often have some sort of talent and acquisition person, a recruiter involved. Depending on the environment, the scale of the environment, all of that can be true depending on the case. It's really important to know that that's how it's structured. That might help you once you're understanding, like if you hopefully get an interview. When you get that interview, you can kind of do some background work to understand that committee a bit better. And that can help you to kind of know key talking points or just even kind of areas of interest for that person. I remember one time I interviewed at Travelers, and one of the people on the committee was like their learning analytics person, but had a background as a learning designer as well. So I kind of had some ideas in mind about XAPI, and I had these other topics I was really curious about to kind of engage that person in the process. So just kind of factor that in when you're thinking about that. The committee, the best, most inclusive environments where this happens have clear evaluation criteria. And sometimes that's even takes on the form of like a rubric. What I've done for this most recently that I think has worked pretty well, and maybe Frances could add a little bit to this too if she would like. We've had a lot of like doing a Microsoft form or like a Google form, and rating that applicant, like, did they have those attributes? Can we summarize that? Can we review it individually so we prevent that groupthink? We have those things as a holistic rubric. We do a kind of inner rater step of making sure that we're all evaluating similar kinds of attributes in similar ways, and then we're able to go into the process in full and do that. And I think those are the best ways where you're able to really look at somebody holistically while also building in that kind of equitable practice piece and making sure that you're applying your standards in ways that are really clear. The other piece is when you're building this, you're often wanting to convey that your professionalism, your knowledge. The people on that committee are often professionals from doing that. So there's, I think, an opportunity to really connect that way as well. And I think those are the best. When we're doing this work, one of the things that I've often thought about is if you have other kind of learning designer, learning geeky people, like there's people like to see that in the materials. You know, like, are there ways that they can connect with you and your style of doing it, your approach to doing it, and kind of really what Frances was saying before, imagine you joining their team and the ways that you would enhance and really extend their current abilities. My kind of closing remarks about the process, and we can talk more about like interview questions or kind of some of the practices that way, multi-stage processes, any of that. I really just want to highlight, you know, in these, you should really focus on being, you know, that perseverance piece. Like there's so many parts of the process where you don't see what's unfolding, and there's like scheduling and multiple pieces, and there's just tons going on behind the scenes, and you shouldn't interpret any of that as being any wrongdoing from you or just like you didn't resonate in the process or something like that. It's really that perseverance, be patient. If you have a recruiter relationship, I found that's a really great way to connect. You know, connect with that recruiter, see if you can get a check-in when the timeline's really gone awry or something, and that can also help to move it along a little bit too. So that concludes like the kind of remarks I had prepared and mapped out. Yeah, I wanted to see, are there other questions people had? Are there questions on the kind of committee's end of how the you know, process unfolds from the committee's perspective or any of that? Interviewing tips, any of that. Thank you all for your time. This has been really fun.
That was,
I'm
oh,
sorry.
no, it's okay. I will, you'll go first for the questions, Angela. I wanted to say thank you so much, Adam. That was awesome. I wanted to add 3 of my own little personal things just real quickly. One is to remember that you're also interviewing the job. So it's really important. You know, I talk to a lot of students who are upset when they don't get positions, but it's important to look at, you know, the experience as you're interviewing them and they're interviewing you. It needs to be a good fit for both of you. And so don't just jump on every opportunity. Really take the time to ask the questions, like Frances was saying, get to know the people and be sure that these are really people you want to work with and a culture that you want to be a part of. I think that's really important thing to remember. The second thing was on the rubric from the hiring side. I think the rubrics have been incredibly helpful for me whenever I've been part of a hiring committee, because we all have inherent biases that we try to shed ourselves of when we're looking at applicants. But having that rubric, I've looked at applicants and thought, you know, just at first pass, oh, these, you know, 3 people look great. But when I really am forced to drill down into a rubric and figure out what skills everyone's bringing, it really helps to help me make a better decision. And my little third thing is like, so such a small thing, but I think it has a huge impact, is writing a thank you note. You know, back in the day, you could write a paper thank you note and it would get there in time. And maybe now it's better to do an email. I don't know. It's been a while since I've had to apply for a job, but I have worked places where the people who hired me had those thank you notes in their offices for years after they hired me. So it really does make a big impact. People appreciate getting those notes. I've also been on hiring committees where a person who just sent a quick, it doesn't have to be anything fancy, a quick email, thanks for your time. Those people come back up in the conversations more often than you would think for such a small gesture. So those are just my 3 little tips. But Angela, I know you had a question.
Thank you. Those are great tips. I was just thinking, how much is too much when you're applying for something and you're trying to sell yourself? We could say a lot, and we might say too much, where people are bored with reading. How to be concise, perhaps using plain language. You know, say what you need to say concisely. But if I had 5 pages, would you be more apt to look at an applicant who only had 3?
This is a really good question. I mean, like, yeah, I think the 3 is a good number. And I think too, like there's ways of so you want to capture, I was talking to my mom recently, lost her job and was applying for jobs, and you know, has this incredible career, and she's like trying to start, like, how do I tell my story that way? And so we talked a lot about like giving a sense of that professional breadth while giving depth in the right places. Like, what are the different ways that you can use that to your advantage, to tell your story, to highlight your broad interest, your adaptability, but also kind of really telling that story. And one of the things I've seen pop up a lot more is in the language selection. I think what you were mentioning, Angela, with like this idea of, you know, covering it in kind of language that's appropriate, and thinking about how to do that in a concise way. One of the things that comes up a lot is if you Google the STAR resume format, that's another thing that comes up a lot, which is kind of a specific, more outcomes oriented way. I think it actually lingers really nicely with designers who are big on like outcomes and thinking about assessment and all that. That's one way that I think people will frame some of those experiences specifically. But yeah, I think there's a benefit. I've seen resumes that are too short, like, which I think is another thing to highlight. But I think you want to set up your resume also to be easily read at a glance. And it's not that it's like we're looking at and then moving on. But I think one of the big things is you want to make sure that you're able to skim it in strategic ways. And so that kind of can help you to think about bullets, thinking about bolding, thinking about emphasizing white space and use on the page. And there are certain studies that you could look for of like how long people will be on a resume. I think if I'm being fully transparent, if we have like a lot of applicants in a first screen, I'm probably looking at for anywhere between like 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how many that we're going through. So think about like if you have somebody doing that, I've seen, you know, people even less, it's like 30 seconds. So you really want to make sure you use those cues and kind of emphasis pieces that way. I see Danielle has a question too. I've been asked to review my online portfolio in the interview. I think it's important to highlight your work and tell the story of how you've achieved that goal or outcome. I love that, Danielle. And I think that's a huge piece of, especially when you get into that kind of interviewing portion. I've had the experience of, by providing my portfolio, when you make it into that second level of the stack, that really helps you to stick out more. And it really helps you to land with them of like, you then have things you can go in and talk about. You could use it to back you up when you're using stories and giving specific examples in the interview. It kind of invites that engagement and continued engagement there with it. Yeah, John.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I've been on a number of hiring committees now that I've been in my position, and I don't, well, I'm not going to say that you can't go too far when you're, you know, saying what's, you know, what things are good about you. But we asked a question in one interview stage about, you know, what's something that you need to work on, or, you know, what things do you see that you need to work on? And we had one candidate, you know, who gave us pretty short answers all the way through, but when he got to that question, just went on and on and on. So I think you can go too far. and it's something that we still laugh about today, because it's like this guy, like he told us every fault that he had, where he didn't necessarily go into that much detail when he was talking about the things that he did well. So I think you just have to be cognizant of what the question is, what the ultimate question, the overall, what the questions are, and I think that's where you can go too far, is like answering too long on a certain type of question. Anyway,
I think that's a great point, John. I mean, like, I feel like this is where prep is really helpful. Like, you should anticipate you'll be asked that question, like, and having two examples of that, depending on what they found interesting or what are things that they're highlighting in their environment. I always tried to have like a pretty good structured response to that. I also find I go too fast when I'm interviewing. You might have picked up on some of that tonight. But like, I find being really strategic about that can be helpful too. So like, if you have some of that prepared, you're covering the right amount of detail, you're hitting on the right points. Yeah. And I think with those kinds of questions, we're not looking for all your faults necessarily with that, right? We're looking for like growth mindsets. We're looking for people who can rebound from learning from failures, and really kind of playing to their strengths. And you're really kind of looking for that focused response. If you don't give that response, it lingers weird with the committee, right? You're like, because it's partially about the communication approach too. It's like, and so that's another huge piece of just kind of having a clear strategy and tactic with that. I saw Angela posted too about we make a first impressions with the presentation of our applications. I cannot emphasize that enough. Like I'm all, and it's not about being perfect, but it's about like really appreciating that, like, that is a first impression. Like, and I think that's a really key thing to think about. Like, what do you want to land in that interaction, and how do you want somebody to see you? Julianne mentions we need to advocate for ourselves and our value. 100%. I think that's one thing I learned from the hiring manager perspective, and I'll share this with all of you as a hiring manager. Like, especially when you get into kind of negotiating and some of that, like, ask for what you're worth. Like, the process is designed to do that. No one's ever going to come back to you with their top offer the first pass. And when I started seeing that as a hiring manager, I was like, wow, I would have approached all those interviews so differently. So this is just me saying that. And also too, that could be like one of the things you might want to think about with advocating is knowing your needs and what you value too. When you have that opportunity at the end of the Zoom interview for ask us questions, I ask a lot about culture during those moments. Like, I ask about professional development is often one of the questions that comes up a lot for me. I'm really curious to see, like, is this the kind of place where I see myself growing and thriving? Those are all things that you can think about as far as your values, and to emphasize with what Kristen was talking about before, like, interview them. That's your real opportunity to do so.
I think it's important. I think Francis said this too, to really be like authentic. And Julianne was kind of talking to this as well about using AI, especially with so much AI being used by people to do so many things. Even when I read student applications, some of them that feel just really, what's the word? Not authentic. The opposite of authentic, it's very kind of like
Formulaic or something.
So yeah, someone's using a template, just really common language, like I work hard, I'm well organized, really try to say the things that make you unique and be as authentic as you can, even in your writing style, because I think that also helps you to stand out from, like Adam said, when you're just quickly reading through so many of these things over time, what's going to make you stand out. Yeah.
I'll be quick, but one of the things that helped me along the way was to stand out was that I anticipate the future, right? I'm not just being complacent. I'm always looking ahead. I'm never standing still. And I always made that clear in my interviews that, I want to go for the next thing, if it makes sense.
Well, that next thing both being, continued advancement professionally, but also just like growing in your knowledge base. We have this one question we often use, Francis, you might remember this one. We had one about like, how do you stay up to date on things happening, whether that's technologies or educational research and learning sciences, like what are the different approaches to that? And this is another one where, kind of like what John was mentioning before, there's a specific way to answer that question that's not from a content standpoint, but you want to make sure that you're not saying the wrong things with that. Like, I'm not growing and developing. You want to make sure that you're really highlighting you're somebody who doesn't stand still in one place. You can help the organization to make sure they're not staying in one place. It's a really key aspect of highlighting that. I'd be glad too if it's helpful to share any interview questions, things like that. I'd be glad to share what we've used for that previously.
I do have one last comment. I talk a lot. I do. Oftentimes, I know that when we're hiring people and bringing them in, they do look good on paper. And it's hard after you've hired the wrong one.
Yeah.
Right? But conversely, if I'm not selling myself and I settle into a job or career that I find isn't a perfect fit for me, then I have the ideas of how do I get out of it and not look like I'm a job hopper. Why did you leave the last place? And then having to have references from that place. So I think it's conversely important that we do our own research and make sure that we're trying to position ourselves in a place where you really want to stay in.
Yeah, it's huge. And I think that gets into some of what the committees or the hiring manager might kind of advocate for as far as like the process. I remember years ago, I was on one of my first search committees for a designer role, and I suggested to my manager at the time, I was like, we should really have a performance task of some sort, like some sort of thing that they can react to and we could see. And so we end up doing like a work through of a work artifact. And if they didn't have a work artifact, we had like another prompt. Like if they were under, NDA or something like that and couldn't. And that I still remember one person who interviewed for that job who eventually became another manager in the team. And that was one of the key moments of like realizing like this person has a lot of the same values that we talk about all the time. It really is a great example of like what they can bring to the team. They're already thinking about some of these things that we think about with quality online learning and teaching practices. And you just really kind of helped to make sure that that was in alignment. And you definitely do want to make sure that you're able to do that. And I guess the other piece of that is like, it's okay to walk. Like I've had offers where I like didn't take it either because the offer wasn't what I needed it to be for it to be good. For me personally with various needs or whatnot. But also like, you had lingering questions, and I'm all about leaning into that. But if there's any kind of red flags going off, definitely lean into that.
Yeah, I think back to your thing about asking for what you're worth too. I have always asked for more, and I have sometimes been told yes, and I've sometimes been told no, but I've never been told, well, since you asked for more money, we're no longer offering you this job. It's just kind of like, well, we did the best we could, and that's back on you to make that decision. So I think that's something to keep in mind too.
One other thing along those lines, I would highly recommend two things. You should make sure to participate in hiring committees if you have the opportunity to do so. You get such a good sense of the inside of that process, and just the complexities of that process and the tensions of that process, everything about it, like you get to see firsthand. And I think it really makes you a better interviewer and interviewee. Like it's a huge piece. The other thing I said to somebody early on, I really try to interview for, or at least apply for jobs once a year. I could be completely happy. This is kind of what happened with Quinnipiac, to be honest. I was pretty happy in my job at Dartmouth, but I was like, I kind of want to go back in person. I was waiting for that right thing to pop up, and stars aligned. I had my materials ready. It wasn't a huge lift for me to do it because I had my stump resume updated. I had a kind of draft cover letter that I've used in the past, and I kind of updated that with the help of ChatGPT, like I was mentioning before. And it was a great outcome. Like, so I just really lean into that, keep those muscles kind of working so they're not atrophying, and it's a good practice to get into. I've actually found that I've learned about my current job through that process too, and talk to hiring managers about that at different points, like my supervisor. I had one boss who I stopped telling that I was learning about other opportunities, but I told her, I was like, at the time I nobly was trying to be like, I'm trying to grow, and then that came off the wrong way, I think. But I think from now I know not to say that, but I'm saying that to all of you. A huge piece of this is you get to then see how you can develop, what are people valuing when they're being forward looking about this, what are the things they're including in job descriptions, how is the field changing, really positions you well to do that, and to see examples of how other organizations work. The best thing I did was interview with an OPM, an online program manager, about 3 or 4 years ago. And I did it because I knew one person was there, but I learned more about how online learning course development happens in different environments from that experience and the networking I had from that. Didn't end up taking the job. It was a whole thing, but it was a really helpful way for me to develop. So that's just to kind of emphasize that learning growth piece as well.
I'm just going to ask this question to anybody who wants to answer it, but I know when I've interviewed, like when I interviewed for my current job, I pretty much knew right away, because the interview turned into, instead of questions and answers, it turned into a conversation, and there was a lot of laughter and it was like, this is going to be great. And actually, a job I had prior to this one, years and years ago, it was the same way, and I knew that was going to be a fit. Those are my two favorite jobs. I'm just wondering if anybody else has had a similar experience to that.
Oh my gosh, Francis, I'm thinking about that interview in the IT space with all of you during the campus visit. Like I find, like, you have to connect with people personally. Like, I remember one of my colleagues, Dave Form, Kristen, like, was wearing a lanyard for Aperture Labs, and I saw that and I was like, you play Portal and Steam games? Like, and these people were like, and I game a little bit, I'm super casual about, but I saw like a connection, like this person's been wearing their lanyard like this for years. And nobody had ever noticed. And he was like, oh my gosh, you play Portal? And they're like, what? This has been in front of me the whole time. So like there could be a moment to like create that personal connection, to create the memorable moment. I remember Francis grilling me about something with the course design process and project management, and she and I just immediately connected as a part of that answer. And it can be a really key when it goes to that next level where you're no longer like kind of interviewing for the job. It's about exploring what that fit is going to be like you were saying, John. It really is a magic.
I'd like
Yeah,
to share. I'm sorry.
No, go, Angela, go.
I had said I was going to shut up, but I'd like to share this one experience, because I did say that I was doing WordPerfect when I applied for a job that required Windows, right? Had no skills. Based on what you've taught us tonight, they presented us with the task of completing exercises in Excel, Word. I couldn't do it. I couldn't, and I completely bombed my interview. However, I did follow up with a thank you, and my thank you got me over. And it was during the interview and my thank you that I demonstrated soft skills, social skills, and what other things that I would bring to the table. And I got a job over people who had experience in it. So it just ties back to what 3 of our facilitators have said tonight.
You can always make up a technical gap. Like, I think that's a huge, and if you're able to show that humility, that vulnerability, like, you can't teach that, like that. And that's a character thing, right? Like, that's something that you have to let kind of sing in that moment that way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, whenever we look at people, Francis, weigh in, like, if they're missing a certain skill, unless it's like detrimental to like the team's operations in like a foundational way, they're never outruled for that. It's just kind of part of this picture that you're filling out. But I love that, Angela.
And now I'm expert facilitator for all of the things that I failed at. I teach it across the organization now.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, I will say that that's one thing I've found after the committees I've been on is, and I've told my son this because my son's definitely like, "Oh, I don't fill all the requirements, so I'm not going to apply for this job." And that's what I found is like apply anyway because nobody has all these requirements. Like all you got to do is make the connection. So
Yeah, it's a huge piece, and I think we know that the people, white men will apply for those jobs, and like they'll not think about that necessarily. And I'm taking this aside, like I just to emphasize like this point, like it's really key. Like if you see any connection to that role, put an application in. Make sure your resume connects those pieces of the story, because it really is about getting off the stack and getting into that next step, and thinking about it that way. I'm really glad you were able to help your son with that, John. That's huge.
I will wrap us up. I think Francis, did you have one more thing to say? You're all the way from vacation, so I feel like you should be able to chime in.
I think that for me, looking at an applicant, the soft skills are probably at the top of the list. The other skills, it can be they're training issues. So I'm always looking for that fit of the person and the culture, and I'm looking at the skill set. Yeah, it is important, but I know that as a teacher, you can train people. So I think that, yeah, the like I forget the student's name, but you know, if you hire the wrong person with the wrong personality, right? If the fit isn't there, and then you're stuck with that person, it's difficult, you know. So I'm sorry, I forgot the person's name.
It was Angela.
Angela, yeah. So what she, you know, I hear her. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks,
I
Francis.
just realized a really funny connection that Francis actually hired me to Quinnipiac like a long time ago, and I was on Adam's hiring committee, so I just realized it's sort of weird the three of us are in this
Oh,
conversation.
we are full circle. That's amazing.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you so much, Adam, for all of the really great information and your presentation, and Francis for adding all the additional context from your experiences. And thank you everybody for being here tonight. I hope it was useful. If you have follow-up questions, feel free to send them over to me or to directly to Adam or Francis or to all three of us. We're always happy to help students and people, find the positions that are right for you. So thank you everyone for being here, and have a great summer. We're done with webinars. Phew, for the year, and we'll be back in the fall. So thank you, everyone.
Feel free to connect on LinkedIn and stuff too. Like drop a line. See you all. Have a good evening.
Thanks,
Have
everybody.
a good vacation, Francis.
Yeah.